The darkness moved before KL did. He had learned that the hard way 7 weeks ago, when the Vorith first came, when the sky above the Tagris belt cracked open like a badly healed wound, and the ships poured through in silence. Not the dramatic engine roaring, city-leveling silence of the old stories. A different kind. The silence of something that doesn't need to announce itself because it has already decided the outcome. Kale pressed his back against the shredded hull of Outpost 17 and breathed through his nose. The cold was a particular kind of cold, the kind that comes from a sun you can no longer fully see, filtered through whatever the Vorith had seeded into the atmosphere in the first 3 days. Not poisonous. Not to humans, anyway. The Vorith seemed to prefer operating in the dark, and so they had simply made more of it, drawing particulate clouds across the Tagris belt that dropped the available light by 60% and turned midday into a gray, perpetual dusk. He breathed. He counted 1. The shape at the far end of the access corridor had not moved in 40 seconds. 2. The sound from the eastern trench had stopped, which was more concerning than if it had continued, because at least sound meant he knew where the thing was. 3. He still had 11 rounds in the Pharaoh 7 and 6 in the backup piece on his left hip, and after that he had a fixed blade and the particular human talent for making bad situations worse. He breathed again and gave himself a single, quiet moment to think about the flask in the breast pocket of his jacket. Not to drink it. He couldn't afford to drink it. Not now. But to think about it. His father had given it to him the morning Kale shipped out, 17 years old, and trying very hard to look like a man who was not afraid. His father had pressed the flask against his son's chest with both hands and said nothing, just held it there. Kale had understood. This is the thing that comes back with you. You make sure it comes back. He had drunk from it exactly 3 times. Each time was a significant occasion. He intended for this not to be the 4th. The shape at the end of the corridor shifted. Kale had been watching the Vorith for 6 weeks. Most people who had watched them that long were dead, which was partially a statistical reality and partially a testimony to what happened when you watched them and then tried to run. You couldn't run from the Vorith. They didn't chase you. They just arrived somewhere ahead of you, already waiting, which implied something about how they moved through space that the xenobiologists on Meridian Station had written 12,000 words about before. The station went silent on the 40th day. What Kale had learned in 6 weeks of watching could not be reduced to 12,000 words. It could be reduced to they use the dark the way a human uses a weapon. They don't move through it, they use it. It is part of them, or they are part of it, or both. And trying to decide which one was a question for people who had more time than he did. He also knew they're patient, but they are not immune to impatience, the way a predator that has been sitting for too long will make a small, involuntary adjustment in its haunches. The Vorith did something like that, a tension in the shape of the darkness that, if you had watched them long enough, you could read as, it has been 40 seconds, and the target has not moved, and this contradicts the expected behavior pattern. Kale moved, not away from the shape. That was the mistake people made. Toward it, low and fast, inside the angle of whatever sensory apparatus the Vorith used instead of eyes, and past it, through the gap in the hull plating, where the third panel had been blown outward 3 weeks ago by a plasma charge that had taken Corporal Yana, Dre's with it. He did not let himself look at the dark stain by the gap. He went through it and into the open and ran. The Tagris Belt had been a settlement zone. 16 outposts, a refueling station, 2 agri platforms, and the relay tower that connected all of them to the Meridian comms net before the net went down. Now it was a ruin, not a dramatic ruin, not the cinematic rubble of a great battle, but the kind of ruin that comes from systematic, methodical disassembly. The Vorith had not bombed Tagris. They had taken it apart, building by building, structure by structure, with what appeared to be a thorough, organizational purpose that nobody had yet been able to identify. They were looking for something, or cataloging something, or both. Kale knew this because he had watched them do it. He ran until he hit the embankment south of the old Agri Platform access road and threw himself into the drainage ditch and lay still, face down in 4 inches of cold, dark water, listening. Nothing followed him. This was the 3rd time in 6 weeks that nothing had followed him, and each time he had been surprised, which he took as a sign that he had not yet fully understood something about the Vorith. They were enormously capable hunters. They had demonstrated this against the 47 people who had been in Outpost 17 when they first arrived, who were now, with the exception of Kale, gone. Not killed, as far as he could determine. Gone. The Vorith took people. Where they went afterward was a question that lived in the part of Kale's mind he had very deliberately partitioned off behind a door he did not open. He lifted his head from the water and looked at the sky. The sky in the Tigris Belt these days was the color of an old bruise. Yellowish gray at the horizon, deepening to a dusty purple directly overhead, and somewhere up there, above the particulate clouds, above the orbital layer, the Vorith motherships hung in positions that had not changed since the fourth day. 4 of them, roughly triangular in shape, the size of small moons, each one connected to the others by what the Meridian xenobiologists, in the 12,000 words they had managed before going silent, had described as a form of extended matter manipulation that bears no resemblance to any known propulsive or structural technology. They had included in this description 17 diagrams. Cale had read the whole document twice, in the light of a small chemical lamp, lying on the floor of a sealed storage room in what used to be the Agri Platform Commissary. He had found one sentence in it genuinely useful. The Vorith appear to operate under a unified cognitive architecture, suggesting that damage to, or interference with, any single unit may produce cascading disruption across the collective. He had circled that sentence. He had thought about it every day for 6 weeks. He was thinking about it now, lying face down in a drainage ditch in the dark. He got up, wrung out his left sleeve as best he could, and started walking. The person who had exiled Cale from his camp was named Commander Petra Solis, and she had done it in front of 14 people in a tone of voice that was technically calm and actually furious, which was her characteristic register for moments she did not fully control. The camp was in the sub-basement of the old relay tower. Solis had found it, organized it, provisioned it, and defended it for 5 weeks, which was a genuine achievement and the reason Cahill respected her even when she was wrong, which she sometimes was. The camp had 31 people in it when Cahill arrived. It had 29 when he left, because 2 of them had died in the 3 days between his arrival and his exile, and Solis had looked at both deaths and looked at Cahill and made a calculation. "You're active," she had said. This was her word for it, active, as opposed to the camp's chosen posture, which was quiet, still, invisible. "I've been watching them," Cahill said. "I know how they move. I know some of what they're... You bring activity into proximity with this position. The 2 people we lost in the last 3 days were in sectors you had been operating in." "Correlation," Cahill said. "I can't afford the argument." He looked at her. He had known Petra Solis for 4 years. She had been his sector liaison before all of this, a bureaucratic title that had meant a great deal of disagreement over supply allocations, and, on one occasion, a bottle of bad Meridian grain liquor shared over a malfunctioning heater at Ovo 300 row. He liked her. He respected her. He was also fairly certain she was making a decision that would get everyone in the camp killed. But he knew she would not be able to hear that, not in the particular register she was operating in. He had 14 people looking at him. Some of them were afraid of him. He could read it in the particular flatness of their expressions, the way people look when they want you to leave but don't want to admit that's what they want. He thought about saying, "You will need what I know." He didn't say it. It felt too much like a threat, and he had learned, from his father, and from 17 years of service, and from 6 weeks of surviving things that had killed better people than him, that the things that feel like threats usually become threats, whether you intend them to or not. He took his pack. He took his weapons. He took the flask. He nodded to Solis, and she nodded back, and he climbed the maintenance ladder up through the relay tower and came out into the gray Tagris light and was alone. He had been alone before. It was not comfortable, but it was not new. The feeling he hadn't expected was the other one, the one that arrived about 3 hours after he left the camp and settled in next to him like an unwanted companion. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was closer to a kind of grief, not for himself, but for the fact that other people existed, somewhere behind him in the dark, and he was not allowed to be useful to them. He had always been better at useful than at safe. The relay tower itself was what he needed to reach, not the sub-basement where Solis's camp lived. The tower proper, specifically the transmission array at its apex, which was, as far as Cahill could determine, still structurally intact. The Vorith had not disassembled the tower. It was one of the things they had so far declined to take apart, and the xenobiologist's document had mentioned in passing that the Vorith appeared to have a complicated relationship with certain kinds of electromagnetic transmission. Complicated was a word that Cahill had circled in red. He didn't have a plan yet. Plans required components, and the components he needed required access to the tower's equipment room, which required getting past the 2 Vorith units he had observed maintaining in the tower's approach corridor for the past 9 days. He walked south, toward the abandoned equipment caches that he had been gradually consolidating over the past 3 weeks. He moved the way he had learned to move in Vorith territory, Slowly enough to reduce heat signature, low enough to avoid skyline silhouette, randomly enough to disrupt any predictive tracking system that relied on pattern recognition. This last part he had figured out by accident. He had noticed that the Vorith seemed to lose interest in targets that moved without apparent direction. They were, he suspected, very good at reading purpose. A thing moving with purpose was a threat or a resource. A thing moving without apparent purpose was perhaps below the threshold of concern. He had spent 4 days practicing moving without apparent purpose, which was harder than it sounded. Humans are purposeful creatures. Removing purpose from your movement, while still actually moving toward a specific place with a specific goal, required a kind of split consciousness that he found exhausting, and once he had it, faintly interesting. He reached the first cache at what passed for 0400 in the gray Tigris dark. The cache was under a plasteel sheet wedged behind the remains of a thermal processing unit. It had 4 plasma charge units, a partial spool of signal wire, a handheld spectrum analyzer that he had pulled from the wreckage of the refueling station, and a collection of components he had assembled over the past 2 weeks with a purpose that had been forming slowly in the back of his mind, the way plans do when you don't have enough information yet to call them plans. He sorted through the components for the 3rd time. His hands worked by feel in the dark. He had been doing this for 2 weeks, and he could identify every piece by texture and weight. There was a kind of pleasure in that, in the competence of hands that knew what they were doing, and he let himself have it because small pleasures were the currency of survival, and you had to spend them when you had them. The plan, as it existed, was this. The Vorith collective cognitive architecture meant that disruption to one unit produced cascading effects on the others. The xenobiologists had observed this in the early hours of the occupation and recorded it carefully, with the scientific detachment of people who were watching something enormous and terrible and did not yet fully understand that it was going to eat them. What they had recorded was, when a Vorith unit was destroyed, the remaining units in proximity entered a period of what the document called architectural recalibration, during which their sensory capabilities were demonstrably reduced. 11 seconds. That was the duration the xenobiologists had measured. 11 seconds of reduced capacity following the destruction of a unit. 11 seconds during which the remaining Vorith were, in measurable ways, less dangerous. Kale had read that and thought, 11 seconds is enough. If you know exactly what you need to do in 11 seconds, if you have already done the preparation that makes those 11 seconds functional rather than frantic, if in other words, you have a plan. He was building the plan. He was building it out of 4 plasma charges, a spool of signal wire, a spectrum analyzer, and the thing that had been forming in the back of his mind since the 3rd week, which was this. The Vorith motherships maintained their positions through the same extended matter manipulation that the xenobiologists couldn't describe. That manipulation operated in a frequency range that the spectrum analyzer, which was designed for refueling station diagnostics, not xenobiology, could nonetheless detect because it was at its outer edges, within the spectrum of electromagnetic phenomena that refueling stations sometimes needed to monitor. He could see the frequency. Not clearly, not precisely, but he could see it, a shadow of it, a suggestion of a signal that, if he could amplify it, or if he could disrupt it, might do something interesting. He didn't know exactly what. That was the part that wasn't a plan yet. He put the components back in the cache and covered it and lay down against the thermal processing unit and watched the sky. He heard them 3 hours later, not with his ears. He had learned. It had taken him 12 days to learn it, and cost him a great deal of very careful observation. That the Vorith did not make sounds in any frequency range that human hearing accessed without aid. What he had learned to hear was the secondary effect, a kind of subsonic pressure that preceded a Vorith unit by approximately 4 meters, a physical sensation rather than a sound, a compression in the chest that you might mistake for anxiety if you didn't know it had an external source. He felt it now. More than one source. Coming from the northeast and also from directly west, which meant they were not tracking him specifically. This was a search pattern, the kind of overlapping grid movement he had observed them using when they were cataloging an area, rather than pursuing a target. He became very still. This was the other thing he had learned, the hardest one, the one that went against every instinct he had been trained with. Stillness, not hiding, not concealment. Actual, total physical and metabolic stillness achieved through a combination of breathing control, temperature management, and the deliberate suppression of the cortisol response that the human body generates in proximity to perceive danger. He had worked on this for weeks. He had not perfected it. But he had gotten good enough at it that twice now, Vorith units had passed within 8 meters of his position and not registered him. He did not understand why this worked, except in the most general terms. The Vorith were exquisitely sensitive to the signs of living things doing living things, moving, generating heat, metabolizing under stress. A living thing that was almost completely quiet was perhaps difficult to distinguish from the baseline biological noise of a post-human landscape. Dead things, dying things, the slow chemical processes of decomposition that had been running in the ruins of Tagris for 6 weeks. He was practicing being dead. The pressure moved across him from west to east, then receded. He waited another 20 minutes after it was gone, counting slowly. Then he got up, drank 3 measured sips of water from his belt canteen, not from the flask, and started moving again. He spent the 32nd day cataloging what he had lost. Not emotionally. He was not in a place for emotional accounting, and would not be for some time, and he understood that. He cataloged it professionally, as one of his instructors in basics service training had told him to do, in the clipped and practical tone of someone who had themselves learned the hard way that grief is not the enemy, but grief at the wrong moment is, you put it in a box, you label the box, you put the box somewhere you can find it, then you continue. He sat in the remains of the Agri platform's northern equipment bay and wrote a list in the small notebook he always carried, in the precise small handwriting that his father had called his engineering font, with a combination of affection and mild bafflement, because his father was a man who wrote in large emphatic loops and had never fully understood a son who did not. Outpost 17, 47 people, names, as many as he could recall with certainty. Recalled 39, he wrote them down, he drew a line. Below the line, 8 names he was less certain of, approximate, marked with a small asterisk. The asterisk names made him feel something he did not look at directly, because they were the names of people he had known well enough to save, if he had been more capable, and not well enough to name correctly in his notebook, which was a species of failure that existed in the space between insufficient competence and insufficient attachment, and he could not fully assign it to one side or the other. Solus's camp, the 31, then 29. He had known 8 of them by name. He wrote the 8, and then he wrote 21 others. He paused on this for a while. 21 others was not good enough for a list, and was all he had. He closed the notebook and put it in his left breast pocket, which was where it lived. He looked at the gray ceiling of the equipment bay and listened to the silence for 3 minutes, which was what he had decided silence was worth. 3 minutes, no more, no less. He had not made this decision consciously. He had made it on the 4th day, sitting in the drainage ditch after the first time nothing had followed him, and it had hardened into practice. 3 minutes. Then he got up and went back to work. The 34th and 35th days were the days he almost made a critical mistake. He was moving between cache positions, the southern run, from the thermal processing unit to the old Agri platform water storage, and he encountered a group of Vorith units operating in what he had come to think of as high density, not search grid behavior, not hunting behavior, something else. A cluster of 7 units moving together in the same direction with a uniformity of pace and trajectory that was different from everything he had observed in the preceding weeks. He went very still. He pressed himself into the crack between 2 collapsed storage containers and did everything he knew how to do and watched. The cluster was moving northwest toward the relay tower. He had, in that moment, the thought that he would spend the next week examining from every angle, follow them. It was a direct, uncomplicated impulse that arrived fully formed. The conviction that whatever the Vorith were doing, moving 7 units in coordinated, purposeful motion toward a structure they had been preserving, was information he needed, and that the right response to information was to go toward it. He stayed in the crack between the containers, because the other thing he had learned, the harder thing, the one that cut against the professional instinct that said information is always worth the cost, was that the Vorith moved in ways that seemed obvious in retrospect and were actively dangerous in the moment. The cluster of 7 was not ignoring the terrain as it moved. He had watched this pattern before in smaller formations. They moved as a group through a primary corridor and simultaneously deployed individual units on flanking coverage. Not visible flanking, flanking at angles that a human tactical mind would not naturally model for, because human flanking relied on line of sight, and the Vorith did not use line of sight. If he followed the cluster, he would walk into the flank. He stayed still. The cluster passed. The flanking units, he counted 4 of them, spread at distances between 40 and 90 meters, moving through the ruins on vectors that intersected at a point approximately 20 meters ahead of where he was crouched. move through his position's shadow without registering him. He did not breathe until they were 100 meters gone. He spent the next 2 hours thinking about the geometry of what had just happened, mapping it in his memory, adding it to the accumulated model of Vorith movement that lived in the back of his mind. Then he went back to the cash run, which was what he had set out to do because interrupted work still needed doing. That was the 34th day. On the 35th, he did a different kind of mapping. He went to the northern ridge, slowly, carefully, taking 4 hours to cover a distance he could have covered on foot in 40 minutes, and found the survey station that the Vorith had preserved. He had been avoiding it until he understood more. He understood more now. The station was intact, not merely structurally intact, actively intact, which was to say that its systems were running. The geological sensing arrays were operational. From 60 meters out, crouched behind a ridge of fractured outcropping, he could see the lights on the station's exterior panel cycling in the rhythm that meant system nominal. The Vorith were running it. Not in the sense that Vorith units were inside operating the controls. He couldn't see any units near the station. In the more disturbing sense that the station was operating without human intervention, running its geological sensing protocols, and the output was going somewhere. He could see the transmission indicator on the exterior panel, a small green light that pulsed when the station was actively broadcasting, and it was pulsing to the mother ships, presumably. The data about the Tigris Belt's geology was being transmitted upward. He thought about this for a very long time. He turned it over the way he turned everything over, slowly from multiple angles, without committing to an interpretation before he had looked at it from enough sides. The Vorith were studying, not cataloging and moving on, studying the geological data, the structures they had preserved, the systematic disassembly of everything else. It was research. They were learning the Tigris Belt at a level that suggested they intended to do something with it, beyond simple occupation. He added this to the notebook, not in the grief section. In the other section, the working section, where he kept observations that had not yet resolved into conclusions. He had many pages of observations in this section. He was not troubled by their lack of resolution. Conclusions came when they came, and forcing them was how you got the wrong ones. He climbed down from the ridge and walked back toward the caches. On the 38th day, the day the relay tower became his primary objective, he found the first survivor he had encountered in 4 weeks. She was in the ruins of the agri-platform's secondary processing bay, in a space behind the grain hoppers that she had made into something resembling a habitat, a bedroll, a water collection system, a small chemical light, and a collection of items laid out with a precision that spoke to either a very organized mind or a very frightened one. She was sitting with her back to the hoppers when he came in, and she had a cutting tool raised and ready before he had finished clearing the doorway. "Don't," she said. He raised his hands. He was good at this. He had done it several times in the first week, before the population of Tigris had decreased to the point where it stopped being necessary. Her name was Drina Vasek. She had been a systems engineer on the Agri platform, which meant she understood the electrical and mechanical infrastructure of the Tigris Belt better than almost anyone alive, which was a thing of significant value that Kale's brain processed and filed immediately. She was 30-something, thin from weeks of rationing, with a particular quality of alertness in her eyes that he had come to recognize as the specific alertness of someone who had survived by watching. She lowered the cutting tool about a third of the way when he didn't move. He recognized the calculation she was running. He was armed, she was armed. Proximity made this uncertain, but he had come through the doorway and not immediately committed violence, which updated the probability estimate slightly in the direction of non-threat. "I'm not with Solus," he said on a hunch. A pause. "Solus is dead." He let himself absorb that. He kept his hands up. "When?" 3 days ago, she said it flatly. The flatness of someone who has already processed the grief and come out somewhere on the other side of it. The tower went quiet. "I went past and the sub-basement had been..." She stopped. They found them. He thought about the 31 people, then 29, then the subset of those who had known him, and the subset of those who had been afraid of him. He thought about Solus's voice in its technically calm and actually furious register. He thought about the flask, which was not for grief, but was currently sitting very close to the concept of it. "How many got out?" he asked. "I don't know. I've seen 3 in the past 2 days, moving south." She paused again. "Your Maddox, the one she sent out." "Kale," he said. "Yes. They said you'd been watching them." "I have." She studied him. The cutting tool went down completely, but he noticed she put it in a position from which it could come back up quickly. He respected that. "What do you know?" she said. He told her. "Not everything." There were parts of what he knew that were not yet in a form that could be given to another person without sounding like the particular kind of optimism that gets people killed. But the
So,
structural parts, the 11 seconds, the spectrum analyzer, and the frequency he had been watching, the pattern of the search grids and how the Vorith deployed when they were cataloging versus when they were hunting. She listened without interrupting. He had expected questions, but she sat with the information the way an engineer sits with a new system, quietly, running checks. When he finished, she said, "The relay tower's transmission array. Yes, I know its specs. I helped install the secondary coupling last year." She was quiet for a moment. If you had signal wire and a plasma stage initiator, you could route a spike through the coupling into the array. Depending on amplitude, you might hit the resonant frequency range you're talking about. I've been collecting components for it. I know the array layout. I know which junctions are still intact. She looked at him steadily. How does this end? What happens when you spike the frequency? I don't know exactly, he said, because she deserved that. I have a theory. Tell me the theory. The motherships use that frequency range to maintain positional coherence. The xenobiologists called it extended matter manipulation. If you disrupt the frequency at sufficient amplitude, I think you destabilize their hold on local spacetime coherence, at least temporarily. He paused. The document I read used the word cascading. Everything about the Vorith cascades. I'm betting that includes this. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the gray Tagris dark had deepened to full night, and the chemical light threw soft shadows across the hopper units. That's a significant bet, she said finally. Yes, and if you're wrong, he thought about how to answer that honestly. If I'm wrong, they notice us operating near the tower and we don't come out of it. He met her eyes. If I'm right, we light up every Vorith in the belt like a switchboard. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she reached under the bedroll and pulled out a folded, annotated schematic that he recognized as the relay tower's electrical infrastructure diagram. I made copies of everything before the network went down, she said, spreading it on the floor between them. Show me where your caches are. They spent 2 days preparing. The first evening was strange, not uncomfortable. Exactly. Kale had been operating in compromised conditions for long enough that comfort was not a category he applied to situations, only a gradient of function. Strange in the way of something new operating alongside something old. 2 different survival systems running in parallel, interfering with each other in ways that were sometimes useful and sometimes not. They ate from her ration stores, and his combined, she had been more systematic about food caching than he had, which was the engineer in her, and he had more technical components, which was the tactician in him, and together they were considerably better resourced than either had been alone, which was a straightforward arithmetic that nonetheless had a quality to it. He found himself sitting with longer than the arithmetic warranted. He hadn't talked to another person in 4 weeks. He hadn't realized, until he was doing it again, how much of his cognitive processing he had been doing out loud in the echo chamber of his own skull, running arguments against himself, stress testing conclusions with the half of his mind designated as skeptic. Having an actual skeptic, one with different data, different angles, who pushed back for reasons he hadn't already considered, was not just companionable, it was clarifying. The kind of clarity you don't know you're missing until you suddenly have it. Tell me about the survey station, Drina said on the first evening. She had her spectrum analyzer on the floor between them, going through frequency logs, but her attention was on him. He told her. The pulsing transmission indicator. The geological sensing protocols running without human operation. The conclusion he had reached about the nature of the Vorith's presence in the belt. She listened without interrupting. The way he was coming to understand, she listened to everything. Not passively, but with a very specific quality of attention that processes incoming information against an existing model and flags discrepancies. They're doing resource mapping, she said when he finished. That was my read. More than mineral resources. She turned the analyzer over in her hands. The electromagnetic frequency we're looking at, the one the motherships emit, and the one these structures seem to generate in ranges they care about, that's an energy density profile. They're not just reading the geology, they're reading energy density at depth. She paused. The Tagris belt has unusual deep mantle thermal activity. The Agri platform was positioned here specifically because of geothermal energy access. The water plant runs on it. The relay tower's secondary power source is a geothermal tap. She looked at him. They found a high-yield energy environment, and they're mapping it from the top down. He had not connected these points. He had come close. The 3 preserved structures, their electromagnetic output, but he had framed it as energy feeding rather than energy prospecting. The distinction mattered. They're going to extract it, he said, eventually, if we let them finish the survey and optimize their access architecture. She looked down at the analyzer, which means the window isn't infinite. At some point, they finish the survey and the next phase begins, and the next phase is probably infrastructure that we really don't want in place. He absorbed this. It shifted the urgency calculus. He had been working with the assumption that the Vorith were patient enough that his own timeline was the binding constraint, that he had the luxury of the preparation time his plan required. If they were on a survey schedule, how long? He asked. I don't know. I don't have enough data on their methodology. She met his eyes. But I'd estimate we have days to weeks, not months. Then we don't have days to prepare. We have hours. She nodded. It was a short nod, the kind that closes an argument rather than opening one. They revised the preparation timeline. It was tighter than he had planned and looser than he had hoped for, which was where most things ended up in his experience. He did not say this out loud. It was not a useful observation. In those 2 days, Kale learned that Drina Vasek had survived by practicing a version of the same stillness he had developed, arrived at independently through engineering logic rather than tactical instinct. She had analyzed the Vorith's sensory footprint from the data the Agri platform's environmental monitors had recorded in the first 72 hours and concluded that their detection suite was motion spectrum biased, meaning they were very good at identifying the signature of directed movement and relatively poor at static biological presence. She had essentially derived the same practical conclusion from a completely different angle. We got here the same way, he said on the second night, eating ration paste from a foil pack while they went over the tower approach for the fourth time. Yeah, you had fewer data points. I had my own data. She gave him a brief, dry look that he interpreted as respect expressed in the language of an engineer. Acknowledgement that the result was valid, even if the methodology was improvised. They argued about the sequence of the operation, which was productive. She thought the plasma charges should be staged on a delay to give them time to reach the array room before the Vorith. Architectural recalibration ended. He thought the delay was too optimistic. 11 seconds was 11 seconds, and the 3 seconds you spent triggering a delayed system were 3 seconds you weren't moving. They went back and forth on this for 90 minutes and ended at a hybrid approach that incorporated elements of both arguments. He had missed this. The specific texture of an argument conducted in good faith between two people with different knowledge trying to arrive at something neither of them would have reached alone. He had not realized how much he had missed it until it was happening. On the second morning, she found 3 of the survivors from Solus's camp. 2 men and a woman moving south through the ruins of the outer settlement perimeter, thin and frightened and alive. They came into the secondary processing bay, and Drina gave them water and ration paste, and Kale explained what they were planning with the economy of language you use when you need people to understand something quickly and don't want fear to crowd out comprehension. Their names were Meret Salas II, no relation, he insisted, with a grimness that suggested otherwise, and a woman named Fen, who now turned out to have been, before all of this, a structural demolition specialist. When Kael described the plasma charge arrangement, Fefens listened with the particular quality of attention that specialists bring to things they know, and then made 3 modifications to his plan that were each individually better than what he had proposed. Where were you 6 weeks ago? He said. Hiding, she said. She said it without humor, which meant he shouldn't push it. He didn't push it. They now had 5 people, not an army, but 5 people correctly positioned, each doing the specific thing they were actually good at was not nothing. He had, in 17 years of service, seen 5 correctly positioned people accomplish things that battalions hadn't. He spent the 3rd morning watching the tower. The 2 Vorith units in the approach corridor had been there for 9 days. They had not varied their position by more than 2 meters in any direction. This was, he had noted, different from the search grid behavior he had observed in open terrain. These units were holding position with a specific, intentional quality, as if the tower were a thing they were guarding rather than cataloging. He had thought about this for 9 days. He was still thinking about it. The relay tower was one of 3 structures in the Tagris belt that the Vorith had not disassembled. The other 2 were the old survey station on the northern ridge and the water processing plant. He had spent time with that pattern. He had turned it over from every angle. The xenobiologist's document hadn't touched it. It was written too early, before the pattern was visible. He thought about what the 3 structures had in common. He had been thinking about it since the 4th week. They were all structures that generated, processed, or transmitted specific kinds of electromagnetic phenomena. The survey station, geological sensing arrays. The water plant, its treatment systems ran on electromagnetic induction coils. The relay tower, communications transmission. The Vorith were not avoiding these structures. They were preserving them. He sat with that. They were preserving them, not because they needed them for the same purpose the humans had built them for, but because the electromagnetic phenomena they generated were, perhaps, something the Vorith used, or needed, or fed on. The frequency range he'd been watching on the spectrum analyzer wasn't just the plot frequency of the mothership's positional coherence. It was a frequency the Vorith were drawing on, an energy source. The structures they were preserving were sources of that energy, and he was planning to spike a massive electromagnetic discharge through the relay tower's transmission array. He was going to spike the Vorith's power supply. He went back to the secondary processing bay and found Drina immediately, because this changed the math. She worked with the spectrum analyzer for 6 hours. He watched her and stayed out of her way, which was its own kind of difficulty for him, but he had enough self-awareness to recognize that this was not a moment for tactical improvisation. This was a moment for electrical engineering. What she found working through 3 iterations of frequency analysis was this. The relay tower's transmission array, at full power, could generate an output in the relevant frequency range, equivalent to approximately 40 times the normal ambient output from all 3 preserved structures combined. How confident are you? He asked. She moved her hand in a gesture that meant 40 to 60%. That's not nothing, he said. No, she agreed. But it's not everything. Merritt had been listening from the corner. He was quiet, had been quiet since they brought him in, but Kale had noticed he was the kind of quiet that listens rather than the kind that shuts down. If it's 40 times their power supply, he said, what does that do to them? I don't know, Kale said honestly. Neither do the xenobiologists, because they didn't get that far. He paused. Best case, total cascade disruption of their collective architecture. The units lose coherence. The motherships lose position. It buys us something. Worst case, Merritt asked. Worst case. It's a very bright light that attracts every Vorith in the belt to our position. Merritt absorbed this. He had the face of someone who had already been through the worst case and was calibrating how bad another one could be. When do we go? They went at 0200. This was Drina's recommendation. 0200 was the deepest point of the Tagris night cycle, when the particulate cloud layer had cooled enough to create a thermal inversion that, based on her environmental data, had consistently correlated with reduced Vorith search activity. She did not know why. She had a theory involving the relationship between the Vorith and thermal gradients in the atmosphere. She had shared it with him in precise, technical language, and he had understood about 60% of it, which was enough. They moved in the formation they had rehearsed, KL and Fen first, approaching from the southwest, using the shadow of the collapsed storage units to mask their thermal signature. Drina and Marit following 50 meters behind, carrying the signal wire and the modified plasma charge initiator. Solace 2 on the northeast approach, which was the angle most likely to draw attention if something went wrong, which was why KL had suggested it, and why Solace 2 had agreed, in the particular way that people agree to things they know are dangerous because not doing them would be worse. The approach took 40 minutes. KL spent those 40 minutes in the particular mental state he had learned to. Access before an operation. Not calm, not focused in the way the word focus implies, but something more like a controlled expansion. All his senses wide open, all his processing active, his judgment working at the speed of the sensory data rather than ahead of it. He had been in this state before. In 17 years of service, he had been in it many times. It never got comfortable, it got familiar, which was different. The Vorith units in the approach corridor were exactly where they had been for 9 days. He had expected this. He had built the operation around it. Fen had 3 seconds to position the charges from the blind angle at the corridor's eastern end, which required the kind of still, precise movement that her demolition's background made possible. She did it the way a professional does a professional thing, without apparent effort, which means without wasted motion. The charges were in position. He looked back at the tower access point. Drina and Maret had reached the maintenance panel on the tower's south face. He could see Drina's hands moving on the panel in the gray dark, and the quality of her movement, unhurried, systematic, made something in his chest loosen a fraction. She looked up and gave him a signal. Ready. He looked at Fen. She gave him the same signal. He thought about the flask. He did not drink from it. He thought about his father's hands pressing it against his chest. He thought about 31 people who had become 29, who had become numbers he didn't know yet, somewhere in the dark south of here. He thought about the 3 survivors in the processing bay who had agreed to help with this because the alternative was waiting in the dark for something that would eventually find them. He thought about 11 seconds. He signaled Fen. She detonated the first charge. The east side Vorith unit registered the explosion with a physical response he could read from 40 meters. A sudden, sharp reconfiguration of its matter manipulation field. A compression and expansion that was the Vorith equivalent of flinching. And then the 11 seconds. He was moving before the sound finished. Through the corridor gap, past the stunned units, and they were stunned. He could feel it. The subsonic pressure field was fragmented, stuttering, like a signal cutting in and out. Up the interior maintenance ladder that Drina had confirmed was intact, 2 rungs at a time, his hands and feet finding purchase through pure muscle memory, not thinking about it, thinking about the top of the ladder and the door at the top and what came after. He heard Fen's second charge detonate behind him. That bought another 11 seconds for the exterior units. The door at the top of the maintenance shaft opened into the array room. He had been in it before, 3 weeks ago, briefly on a reconnaissance that had nearly been his last. It looked exactly as it had then. Banks of transmission equipment, half of it dark from the network shutdown, and in the center, the main array coupling that Drina had helped install. 2 meters tall, brushed metal, with the secondary junction box on its left side that she had described in detail over 4 hours of planning. He went to the junction box, he had the signals wire in his pack, and the connection specifications that Drina had written out by hand on a piece of foil packaging because paper was heavy and foil wasn't. He opened the box, found the terminals she had told him to find. There, second row, third and fourth from the left, just as she had said, and began connecting. His hands were not shaking. He noticed this with a kind of distant clinical interest. He had wondered if they would shake. 50 meters below him, Drina was doing the same thing in reverse, preparing the initiator connection on the maintenance panel that would route the discharge from the initiator through the tower's primary power coupling and up into the array. She had explained this connection to him 3 times to make sure he understood what he was connecting to, because the initiator was designed for plasma charges, and what they were doing was using it to trigger a controlled power spike through a relay transmission array, which it was not designed for, which meant that the tolerances were approximate. How approximate? He had asked. Within engineering reason, she had said. He had decided not to ask what engineering reason meant in this context. He finished the connection. He pulled the signal wire taut, down through the maintenance shaft to the room below, where it would feed into Drina's connection. The wire was the link, the relay. He had spent 3 weeks collecting enough of it for exactly this. He hit his communicator, 2 clicks, the signal they had agreed on. Below, he heard Drina's return, 2 clicks. He put his back against the array coupling and prepared for what came next. Because what came next was the part that required him to be in the array room when the discharge happened, because someone had to be at the top connection to manage the current routing if the coupling kicked back, and that person was him, and he'd explained this to the others in terms that made it sound like a technical necessity, which it was, and had not dwelt on the part where being in the room when a relay array discharged at 40 times its normal power output was not a comfortable place to be. He breathed, he counted 1, 2, the array lit up. It was not a sound so much as an event. A physical happening that encompassed every frequency range his body was capable of detecting, and several that it wasn't. He was pressed against the metal coupling by the output wave, his back against it, his feet skidding on the floor before he got his footing, and the light was wrong for light. It was something that read as light to his eyes, but was clearly also other things, electromagnetic things that moved through him like a hand through water. He felt his teeth vibrating in his skull. He felt the flask against his chest, heated by something he couldn't name. He counted. 3 seconds. 5. 8. He grabbed the current routing valve, a physical component, old technology, analog, specifically because Drina had insisted on having an analog failsafe SIF, because analog failsafes did not fail the way digital ones did, and held it in the position she had told him to hold it. His arm was shaking now, not from fear, but from the electromagnetic output, a physical vibration that ran from the coupling through his hand and up his arm and into his shoulder. He held it. 12 seconds, 15, 20. The array had not been designed to run at this output for more than 8 seconds. He was on 20. He felt the coupling casing heating under his back. He held. 30. Drina had said, 30 seconds minimum. If the theory was right, 30 seconds would be enough. 32. He released the valve. The light died. The vibration stopped. His body felt like it had been wrung out and put back loosely. He slid down the side of the coupling until he was sitting on the floor with his back against it, breathing through his mouth, and he sat there for 3 seconds that were the loudest 3 seconds he could remember. Then he heard it. Not heard it, felt it. The subsonic pressure of the Vorith, the compression in the chest that he had learned to read as proximity, but different, changed. Where it had always been directional, purposeful, moving, it was now oscillating, back and forth, like a signal trying to find a carrier frequency and failing. He got up. He went to the array room's exterior viewing slot, a small panel of reinforced transparent material that looked out over the Tigris belt, and looked out. The particulate cloud layer was lit from above. Not explosively. Not the way a battle lights up a sky. The way a lamp lights a lampshade from inside. A slow, pervasive illumination, spreading from points that were, he realized, the positions of the 4 motherships. The clouds lit from above, and the light shifted through colors he had no names for, cycling through the spectrum in a way that felt like watching something try to recalibrate, or recoordinate, or remember what it was doing. Then the first mothership moved. It had not moved in 42 days. It moved now in a way that was wrong, not the deliberate, controlled movement of a positioned vessel, but a drift. A loose, uncoupled drift, like a mooring line cut, like a thing that had been held in place by a force that was no longer operating. The second moved, and the third. The fourth did not move. The fourth, he watched it through the viewing panel, pressing his forehead against the transparent material. The fourth contracted, became something less than its former shape, then expanded back, contracted again. A pulse that was also a sound, now or close to a sound, in a register below hearing but above feeling, somewhere in the middle of the body where you didn't have a name for the sense. He went back to the communicator and hit it 3 times. Come up. Drina arrived first because she was closest, coming through the maintenance shaft with the controlled, methodical speed of someone who doesn't hurry but doesn't stop. She went immediately to the viewing panel. She looked at the sky for a very long time without saying anything. He stood beside her and let her look. It worked, she said finally. It was not a question. Partly. She turned to look at him. The disruption worked, he said. They've lost cohesion. The motherships are losing position. He paused. But they're not gone. They're destabilized. There's a difference. She looked back at the sky. The drifting motherships were now visible as moving shapes through the thinning clouds. The cloud layer itself was changing, breaking apart, which made sense if the cloud seeding had been maintained by the mothership's positional output, and the positional output was now disrupted. How long does destabilized last? She asked. I don't know, he said. The document didn't address it because nobody had ever destabilized them. Before, he paused. I would guess. As long as the cascade continues, as long as the disruption propagates through the collective architecture, and if the cascade stops before the ships leave position, then they recalibrate, and they know someone in the Tigris belt knows how to disrupt them. She absorbed this, which means they come back to the tower. Yes. Which means we have a window. Yes. He looked at her steadily. You understand what I'm about to say. She looked back at him with the dry clarity of someone who is, right now, also saying it. We need to transmit everything you know. Everything I know. The spectrum analysis, the frequency data, the architectural vulnerability, the cascading disruption effect. She looked at the array behind them. The array is still live. The Meridian comms net went down, but the long-range broadcast frequency is independent of the local net. If anyone out there is still listening, there is a colony on Ferris Station, he said. 11 light minutes out. If they have a receiver pointed this direction, someone will have a receiver pointed this direction. Someone always does. She was already moving to the array's primary transmission console. Help me. He sat down beside her and they started working. The Vorith came for the tower on the 52nd day. It was not unexpected. They had transmitted for 9 hours. Everything they knew. Compressed and repeated. Broadcast in 6 frequency ranges, at every signal amplitude the compromised array could manage. They had included Drina's full frequency analysis, Kale's observational records from 6 weeks of watching, Fenn's demolitions assessment of the plasma charge detonation parameters, and a summary of the cascade architecture vulnerability that ran to 11,000 words and was far more organized than the xenobiologist's document because it had been written by people who were currently inside the problem, rather than observing it from what they had imagined was a safe distance. They had also transmitted coordinates, not of the tower, the Vorith knew the tower, but of the 38 people they had found over the 9 days of the transmission window. 38 survivors from the Tigris Belt camps, gathered in by Moret and Solace II, and Fen and a woman named Greya, who had appeared on the fourth day with a working medical kit, and the particular competence of someone who had been keeping people alive in improvised conditions for weeks. 30 people in the sub-basement of the UPS water processing plant, which the Vorith had not, even in their destabilized state, moved to disassemble because it was still generating the frequencies they depended on and even disrupted. The Vorith were not irrational. On the 52nd day, 2 Vorith units entered the relay tower's approach corridor. Kale watched them come on the improvised camera system Drina had assembled from Agri platform monitoring equipment sitting in the array room, which they had not left in 9 days except to eat and sleep in rotation. She was sleeping now, 3 hours into a 6-hour rotation, and he had decided not to wake her yet. She needed the sleep. He needed the 5 minutes of sitting alone with what was happening. He looked at the screen. He looked at the sky. The motherships had been drifting for 9 days. 2 of them had drifted significantly out of their original positions, out of the belt's orbital plane, into trajectories that the basic astronomy Kale had learned in school told him were not stable and would continue to degrade. The other 2 had partially recalibrated, stopping their drift, but their positional coherence was still oscillating in the way he had observed from the viewing panel on the first night. He did not know if any of it was enough. He had transmitted everything. The window would close when the Vorith reached the array room and the transmission stopped. After that, it was not his problem to solve. It was Ferris Station's problem, and whoever beyond Ferris was still listening, and whatever they could do with 11,000 words of carefully documented vulnerability data and the knowledge that one person on a post-apocalyptic settlement in the Tigris Belt had spent 6 weeks learning how to make the Vorith hurt. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the flask. He opened it. He sat for a moment with it open, smelling the particular smell of it, grain liquor and metal, and something that was just time, years of being carried against a body. And he thought about his father's hands. He thought about the morning he had shipped out, the particular quality of his father's silence. He thought about the 38 people in the water plant sub-basement. He thought about Solus, whose technically calm and actually furious voice he realized going to miss. He thought about the 3 people from her camp who had come to him in the dark and agreed to do dangerous things because the alternative was worse. He drank. It was the 4th time. He decided this was a significant enough occasion to count. He put the flask away. He got up. He went to the door of the array room and opened it and leaned into the maintenance shaft. "Drina," he said. "Time." She came up in 4 minutes, which was fast for someone who had been asleep. She sat at the transmission console and looked at the camera screen and the 2 Vorith units in the corridor and said nothing for a moment. "How long do we have?" she asked. 10 minutes. Maybe 12. She looked at the array. "We could rig the plasma coupling for another spike." "We could," he said. "It would buy time. The array would be permanently non-functional afterward." She thought about this. If we do a second spike, they can't ever use this tower again. As a power source, as anything. He paused. "But neither can we." She looked at him. He looked back at her. "Do it," she said. He was already moving. The second spike was larger than the first. Drina had 9 days of data on what the first one had done and she had used that data to modify the initiator configuration in ways that pushed the output amplitude to something she described as outside the engineering envelope, with a flatness that meant this is a thing we are doing because there is no envelope left to stay inside of. They triggered it from the array room, both of them, at opposite ends of the transmission console, with their backs to the coupling and their eyes on the camera screen. He watched the Vorith units in the corridor on the screen. They stopped. It was not the flinch of the first detonation. It was something more fundamental, a cessation, as if the thing that drove them had simply abruptly been removed. They stood, if standing was the right word for what the Vorith did, and then they did something he had never observed a Vorith unit do in 6 weeks. Of watching, they moved backward, 1 meter, then 2, then to the entrance of the corridor, and then past it, and then out of frame. The light from the coupling was behind him, pressing against his back, cycling through the nameless colors. Through the viewing panel, he could see the sky, and the sky was lit from above again, but not the same way as the first time. The first time had been a lamp inside a lampshade. This was something coming apart, a brilliant, cold, spreading light that had no natural analog in his experience, moving outward from the positions of the mothership's invisible waves, like the rings a stone makes in water, each ring larger and faster than the last. One of the motherships began to come apart. He watched it happen with the same quality of controlled expansion that he brought to operations everything wide open, processing at the speed of the incoming data. The ship was large. It had been large for 42 days. Now it was becoming something that was not large, or at least was becoming large in a different way, its mass redistributing outward in patterns that were clearly not explosion, but were not cohesion either, something in between, something that might be what an entity made of extended matter manipulation looks like when the manipulation fails. The second ship followed. The third began the same process and then stopped. He felt the change in the subsonic pressure before he understood what it meant. The remaining two ships were recalibrating, pulling back, doing the thing they did when they decided that a thing was not worth the cost of continuing. He had seen this behavior twice on a small scale, when he had successfully discouraged a search pattern. He had never imagined seeing it on this scale. The Vorith were withdrawing. Not all of them, not instantly. But the motherships were moving with purpose now. With the directional quality of ships going somewhere rather than holding position, and the units in the Tagris belt, he could feel it in the pressure readings, and the quality of the subsonic field were moving with them, contracting toward the ships, being drawn back. Drina's hand found his arm. He looked at her. She was looking at the viewing panel, at the sky, at the spreading light where the two disassembled ships had been, at the remaining two moving away. Her expression was the expression of an engineer watching a system operate in a way it was not designed to operate and producing an outcome that the design documentation did not predict. "It's working," she said. "Yes," he said. "You don't seem surprised." He thought about that. "I believed it would work," he said. "Believing something doesn't prepare you for it actually happening." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she said. "I suppose not." The message from Fira Station arrived 31 days later. The 31 days were not quiet days. Quiet days were a concept that belonged to the world before the Vorith, along with sleeping in a bed and eating cooked food and having a horizon that was not a question. In those 31 days, Kale and Drina mapped the Vorith withdrawal. It was not complete, had never been complete, and he had never claimed it was. Two motherships were gone, their mass redistributed into something that was either debris or energy, or some category that the xenobiology team on Kellis would eventually characterize when they had time and resources, and the luxury of stable professional distance. The remaining two ships held their positions in the outer arc, pulsing, oscillating, reworking the math of whatever they had been doing. The Vorith units in the belt itself moved differently after the second spike. Less purposefully, the catalog grid patterns were disrupted, irregular, suggesting something in the coordination architecture had degraded. He watched them from positions that had become increasingly comfortable to reach, which itself told him something. Their detection sensitivity was reduced. He did not let himself treat this as safety. Reduced was not absent, but it changed the operational parameters enough to be significant. On the 9th day after the second spike, Maret and Solace II came back. They came from the south, thinner than when they had left, with 4 more people. 2 young men Kale did not know, a woman named Telka, who turned out to be a former medic from the outer settlement perimeter, and a man named Durr, who had been the relay tower's maintenance technician before everything, and who, when he heard what had been done to the tower's transmission array, looked at Kale with an expression that moved through several stages before settling in the vicinity of awe. "The secondary coupling," Durr said. He said it the way you say the name of something you worked on, something you built with your hands and considered partly yours. You routed a plasma stage initiator through the secondary coupling. "With modifications," Drina said. "With." He stopped. He looked at the array room's burned-out coupling. He was quiet for a while. "I installed that coupling in the 3rd year of the belt's operation," he said. "I did the calibration myself. 6 days of work." He looked at the burned carbon scoring on the ceiling. "I'm glad it was good for something." He said it without resentment, which was the kind of generosity that cost something, and Kale noted it. The camp in the water processing plant sub-basement grew in those 31 days. By the time the Ferris message arrived, there were 41 people there, not the 38 he had sent to Kellis on the irreversible consequence, but 41, including 3 who had arrived on the 22nd day from a position so far south that Kale had not known anyone had survived there. They were in poor shape, all 3, but Telka the medic and Greya together were keeping them functional. 41 people in a room that had been a storage area, sleeping on bedrolls and equipment cases, eating rationed food, living with the particular patience of people who have been told that help is coming, and are choosing to believe it. He checked on them every day. He did not run the camp. Maret had taken that role, and he was better at it than Kale would have been, with the particular quality of calm competence that makes people feel organized without feeling managed. Kale checked in, gave Merritt his daily threat assessment from the perimeter monitoring, answered questions when people had them, and went back to the tower. On the 14th day, a young woman named Essa, who had been in the camp since the second week and was perhaps 19 years old, found him on the water plant's exterior access level, where he went to use the spectrum analyzer in open air. He heard her coming. She moved well, but not silently, in the way of someone who had learned survival necessity rather than practiced invisibility. "Can I watch?" she asked. He considered the question. He had been working alone by habit and preference for weeks, and the habit was deeply enough set that the question required actual consideration rather than reflex. "Yes," he said. She sat at the edge of the access level, cross-legged, and watched him work the analyzer. She didn't ask questions for 20 minutes, which he appreciated. Then she asked, "What does it show?" He showed her. He explained the frequency range the Vorith mothership output, the oscillation pattern that indicated their continuing instability. He kept it simple, not because he doubted her capacity, but because simple was accurate and complexity was not. She watched the display for a while. "It looks like a heartbeat," she said. He looked at the display. "It does," he said. "Is that what it is?" He thought about this. "Something like that," he said. "The way a heartbeat is a sign of a living system." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "What happens when it stops?" "We've disrupted 2 of them already," he said. "When a system like that stops." He paused. "The system that was relying on it stops too." She looked at the display for a long time. "Are there more? Beyond the 4 here?" "Almost certainly," he said. She absorbed this. "And they know that we can do this now." "Yes. So they'll come back different." "Probably." She looked at him. She had the particular quality of directness that comes not from training, but from having been through enough to stop being interested in indirect approaches. "But we'll know more by then too." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's the idea." She nodded, a small, serious nod, and went back to watching the display. He worked beside her until the light changed, and then they went inside. He thought about that conversation for several days afterward. Not the content of it, which was not new information. The quality of it. The 19-year-old who had lost everything she had known, sitting cross-legged on an access platform, reading an alien frequency display with the same focused attention she would have brought to anything important. The question she had asked, "They'll come back different," which was exactly the right question, the one that showed she had understood the shape of the problem rather than just its current expression. That was the thing about humans, he thought. Not any one human, not himself, not Drina, not Essa, not Meret or Fen or Solace too, the sum. The particular way that being in a bad situation for long enough produced, in enough humans, a quality that was something more than adaptation, not the mere capacity to learn from difficulty, which many organisms possessed. Something more stubborn than that, the refusal to let the difficulty be the permanent condition. The insistence, not always reasonable, not always correct, but always present, that the situation was a problem to be solved rather than a state to be inhabited. The Vorith operated on a time scale that made human civilization look like a brief weather event. They had occupied, cataloged, and extracted from more systems than there were humans alive to count. They had not encountered, in all of that time, a species that worked this particular way. He was as certain of this as he had been certain of anything in the preceding 6 weeks, which was a certainty arrived at through observation rather than assumption. They had not been ready for this, and now they knew they needed to be. And that, the fact that they now knew, was an outcome that the Vorith's extraordinary collective intelligence would process and integrate and plan around. Yes, but it would also never unknow itself. The data was in. The Tagris belt had been, without intending to be, a demonstration, an existence proof. Humans are specifically aggravating, stubbornly difficult to use. It was in the record now, for whatever that was worth. It came through the secondary transmission array of the water processing plant, which Drina had spent the intervening 3 weeks bringing to something approaching operational status. Because the relay tower's array had been, as predicted, permanently non-functional after the second spike. It came in a low-gain signal at 0300 Rho, picked up by the monitoring equipment she had repurposed as a receiver. Kale was awake when it came. He had been sleeping poorly, which was his normal condition, in the days after a significant operation, when there was nothing immediate to react to, and his nervous system had not yet updated its threat model to reflect the changed reality. He sat in the processing plant with the 38 survivors and a coffee-adjacent beverage that Fen had synthesized from agri-platform grain stalks, and listened to the message play through 3 times. The message said, We received your transmission. We have been transmitting it outward for 26 days. We have received response from 6 listening stations in the outer arc, including Station Kellis, which has a xenobiology division and a military research component that has been waiting for exactly this kind of vulnerability data since the Vorith appeared. A vessel is being dispatched to the Tagris Belt coordinates you provided. Estimated arrival, 43 days. Hold position. You are not alone. He sat with that for a while. Marit had come awake when the signal started playing and was sitting against the wall across the room listening. When the message finished the third time, he said, 43 days. Yes, Kale said. We can do 43 days. Yes, Kale said. We can. Fen had come in too, and Solace too, and Greya, and then Drina, standing in the doorway with her hair loose, and the particular expression she wore when she was processing something significant and hadn't finished yet. He looked at her across the room. She finished processing. She looked back at him. A short nod, the kind of nod that contains a lot of things without being about any one of them in particular. He looked at the ceiling of the water processing plant, at the old stained metal, and the condensation running in thin lines toward the drains, and he thought about the flask, which was in his breast pocket and was 4/5 full, which meant there were many more occasions ahead of it, and he thought that was probably correct. The ship arrived on the 41st day, which was 2 days early, which was the kind of thing that happened when the people coming to find you had information they cared about, and were not inclined to take the long route. It was a heavy research vessel out of Station Kellis, the CNS Irreversible Consequence, which was a name someone had chosen with either a specific sense of humor or a specific sense of honesty. It came down through the broken cloud layer. The particulate seeding had mostly dissipated in the weeks since the second spike, with its running. Lights on, visible from 60 kilometers, which was the first running lights Kale had seen in the Tigres sky since the 4th day. He stood outside the water processing plant and watched it come down, and around him the 38 survivors were also watching, and the quality of the silence was completely different from every silence he had spent the previous 43 days in. Not the silence of things hidden in dark places, the silence of people watching something arrive. The ship set down in the flat ground north of the old refueling station. Its ramp lowered. People came out. A science team from Kellis's Xenobiology Division, a military assessment unit, a medical contingent, and, leading the whole group, a tall woman in a research division jacket who introduced herself as Dr. Harani Solis, actually no relation, who had been on the receiving end of the transmission for 26 days, and had, in her own words, spent every one of those days preparing for the moment she could ask the person who sent it. How did you know where to look? Kale looked at her for a moment. He thought about 6 weeks of watching. He thought about the 11,000 words, and the spectrum analyzer, and the drainage ditch, and the nights of counting, and the particular discipline of learning to move without apparent purpose. And the moment he had understood that the Vorith were preserving the structures rather than ignoring them. I didn't, he said. I just kept looking. Dr. Solis studied him with an expression that mixed scientific interest with something more personal. Something that had the quality of looking at evidence as an understanding what the evidence had cost. The analysis you sent is the most comprehensive observational document we have on Vorith behavior and vulnerability, she said. Station Kellis is already fielding relay array disruption protocols based on your frequency data in 11 systems. He thought about that. 11 systems. He did not let himself think too long about what those 11 systems might currently look like, what the Tagris Belt looked like everywhere, at scale. He would have time for that, later. I want to show you something, he said. He led her to the Agri-Platform secondary processing bay and showed her Drina's initial habitat, the bedroll, the water collection system, the annotated schematic folded in the corner, the chemical light. He showed her the relay tower approach and the maintenance ladder and the array, room with the burned-out coupling and the viewing panel. He showed her the drainage ditch and the thermal processing unit and the equipment caches. He did not plan this tour. It simply felt necessary, in the way that things sometimes feel necessary without being explainable. He had spent 43 days in these places, and these places had been the materials of something. And the someone from Kellis who had come to understand the something needed to understand the materials too. Dr. Solis walked through each location in silence and looked at each thing he showed her and took notes on a folded pad she kept in her jacket pocket, which was exactly the right response and made him decide he liked her. At the array room, she stood at the burned-out coupling for a long time. You did this from observation alone, she said. No xenobiology background, no physics background beyond basic service training. I had Drina, he said. And before that? He thought about the 6 weeks before Drina, the drainage ditches, the counting, the 4-day practice of moving without apparent purpose, the cold water, the stillness, the circled sentences in the xenobiologist's document, the flask pressed against his chest. Before that, he said, I just kept not dying until I understood something. She wrote something in her pad. He didn't ask what. The 45th day, the CNS Irreversible Consequence departed the Tagris belt with 36 of the 38 survivors bound for Station Kellis, and then onward. 2 people stayed. Kale was one of them. Drina was the other. He had explained it to Dr. Solus in the simplest possible terms. The Vorith had not left the sector. They had withdrawn from the Tagris belt, but their motherships were still in the outer arc, still maintaining the kind of partial positional coherence that the xenobiologists updated document, written now by living people, with his and Drina's data incorporated, described as a holding pattern. They were disrupted. They were hurting. They were not gone. Someone needed to keep watching. Dr. Solus had understood. She had not been happy about it. Her expression in the technically calm and actually reluctant register of someone who had the professional and perhaps also personal recognition that the argument was correct. She had left them a full resupply, a proper communications array with a direct link to Kellis, and a code word that would bring a military response within 72 hours. She had also, when she shook his hand at the ramp, said, You know what you did here will change everything about how we engage with them. I hope so, he said. That's an understatement. He had thought about how to respond that and had not found a response that felt proportionate, so he had said nothing, and she had understood. He and Drina stood on the flat ground and watched the ship rise through the broken cloud layer and become a point of light and then become nothing. The sky was pale and cold and cleaner than it had been in 45 days, with a quality of genuine light that he had forgotten, actual light, unfiltered, the star at the center of this system not fully obscured for the first time in weeks. Drina pulled out her spectrum analyzer. She had been holding it at her side. She looked at the readout. He waited. They're still out there, she said. Yes. Holding pattern. Yes. She lowered the analyzer and looked at the sky with her own eyes. He looked at the sky with his. They'll try again, she said. Not a question. They'll try again, he agreed. When they think they've fixed what we broke. Can they fix it? He considered the question the way he had learned to consider questions that didn't have clean answers. Hold it open. Don't force a resolution. Let it sit. Probably, he said. They're not stupid. They're adaptable. They'll come back with something different. He paused. But we'll know more than we know now, and they'll know we can hurt them. And that. He stopped. Drina looked at him. That matters. That matters enormously, he said. They came here thinking we were a resource. Something to catalog and collect and use. The thing they learned in the Tagris belt is that we are specifically aggravating, stubbornly difficult to use. He looked at the sky. We know something about ourselves that they didn't account for. We don't stop watching. We don't stop learning. We don't stop figuring out how to hurt things that should be impossible to hurt. He paused. That's not a military capability. That's not a technology. It's a characteristic. And they've seen it now. And the next time they show up somewhere, in whatever system, with whatever they fixed, they'll know it's there. Even if they can't find it. Even if they can't calculate for it. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the flask. That's worth something. She looked at the flask. Is that what that's for? She said. It's for significant occasions, he said. Is this one? He thought about it. I think this is one. He opened the flask and offered it to her. She looked at it with the expression of an engineer being offered something that falls outside the measurement system, and then she took it and drank and handed it back. He drank. He put the flask away. The sky was pale and getting lighter. Somewhere in the outer arc, 4 Vorith motherships held their disrupted, oscillating positions and processed what had happened to them and began, in their collective, unified, ancient intelligence, the slow work of calculating a response. They would find an answer eventually. They always did. But so would the people watching them from below, in the ruins of a settlement that had been taken apart and not quite finished. 2 people, sitting on the cold ground of the Tagris belt in the growing light, with a spectrum analyzer and 11,000 words of notes, and the particular human characteristic that the Vorith had not, in all their collective intelligence, managed to count for. The inability to stop, the absolute, unreasonable, structurally fundamental human inability to simply stop watching and stop learning and stop figuring out, in the dark, with inadequate equipment and insufficient data, and the kind of stubborn, expensive hope that had never once in human history turned out to be a reasonable position and had never once turned out to be wrong at the exact right moment. Kale watched the sky. Drina watched her readout. The light grew. Between watching and waiting, he thought about the flask. Not the drinking of it, this was not an occasion for that, not yet. But the fact of it. It was a thing his father had given him to carry, and he had carried it. And it had come through the drainage ditches, and the dark corridors, and the 11 seconds, and the 2 spikes, and the 43 days, slightly dented now at the base from a moment in the 3rd week he would rather not detail, but whole, intact, functioning, which was the word his father would have chosen. His father had been, among other things, a man who believed in the functional value of objects. Not sentimentally, he was not a sentimental man. Functionally, he believed that objects which survived difficult use carried information about the difficult use, and that this information was itself a kind of resource. You looked at the dents, and you knew what had dented it. You knew what hadn't broken it. The knowledge was in the object, and the object was in your hand. And you were, therefore, carrying the knowledge. He understood now, in a way he had only partially understood at 17, that the flask was not the lesson. It was the delivery mechanism. The lesson was the carrying. He thought about Essa and her serious nod. He thought about Durr saying, "I'm glad it was good for something." He thought about Moret's quiet particular listening and Fenn's 3-plan improvements, and Solace, too, taking the most dangerous position without being asked twice. He thought about Greya and the medical kit, and the 3 people from the far south who were still alive because of it. He thought about 39 names he had written correctly, and 8 names he had asterisked, and he looked at both sides of the ledger honestly, and did not look away from either. He would carry all of it. That was the function. You carry what you have, you bring it back, and in the outer arc the Vorith adjusted, and in the outer arc the Vorith adjusted. It was important to understand this, and he had spent the last days understanding it, more fully than he had before, not defeated. This word would be applied to what had happened in the Tagris Belt, would be used in the transmissions that went out from Fira Station, and in the documents the Kellis xenobiology team would write, and in the dispatches that would reach the outer colonies, and eventually, in the way that significant information moves, the places where decisions were made about what humanity did next, defeated, repelled, driven back. These words were true in the way that a partial description is true. The Vorith had withdrawn from the Tagris Belt. 2 of their motherships were gone. Their survey was incomplete. Their resource extraction had not begun. In every measurable tactical sense, they had not achieved what they had come here to achieve. But they were old, vastly architecturally old, in a way that made the word mean something different than it meant when applied to a person, or a building, or a civilization. Their collective intelligence had seen occupations fail before. It processed failure differently than victory, not as an ending, but as a data point. An update to a model that had been running for longer than human civilization had been producing models. They would recalibrate. They would come back. They would come back with the Tagris Belt space data incorporated, with the frequency disruption vulnerability patched or worked around, with whatever countermeasures their ancient, unified, patient intelligence had developed in the interval. He knew this. He sat with it in the growing light, and he knew it, and he was not afraid of it. Not because he was not afraid of things, he was, and had been, and the drainage ditches could testify to that, but because what had happened here had changed the shape of the problem in a way that was permanent. The data was in both directions now. The Vorith knew about humans in a way they had not known before, and humans knew about the Vorith in a way they had not known before, and that knowledge was currently being transmitted outward, station to station, colony to colony, through the long and imperfect and remarkably durable network of human information sharing that had outlasted every attempt to sever it. Somewhere out there, someone was reading Drina's frequency analysis for the first time. Somewhere out there, an engineer like her was sitting up straight in her chair. Somewhere out there, the specific, expensive, unreasonable human process of turning a problem into a solution was already underway. In 11 systems, in as many minds as had received the data, running on the same fuel it had always run on, the refusal to stop looking until you understood something, no matter how dark it was, no matter how long it took, no matter what it cost. They would find an answer eventually. They always did. The light grew over the Tagris Belt, and Drina Vasic read her readout, and Kale Maddox watched the sky with the same quality of attention he had brought to every dark and every dawn for 6 weeks, and in his breast pocket, warm against his chest, a dented flask held its ground.